She was born beneath the golden chandeliers of Versailles, where laughter echoed through marble halls and silk rustled like music. But before her 18th birthday, she had watched her father beheaded, her mother condemned, and her brother die alone in darkness. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, lived 70 years. Yet every dawn felt like another hour inside the temple. They called her Madame Royale, but history remembers her as something else. The princess who outlived a dynasty and spent the rest of her life mourning its ghosts. She came into the world as if destiny itself had paused to listen. On December 19th, 1778, under the gilded ceilings of Versailles, a cry pierced through the winter air. The long-awaited sound of a royal heir. The courtiers rushed through the marble corridors, candles trembling in their hands, whispering the words France had waited years to hear. It's a girl. A healthy girl. Her name was Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and the first child born to a monarchy that seemed eternal. Her parents had waited 8 long years for her birth. 8 years of prayers, rumors, and political anxiety. When she arrived, Paris erupted in celebration. Bells rang, fireworks painted the sky, and people filled the streets shouting blessings for the little princess who would unite France's hope and joy. She was given the title Madame Royale, a name that carried centuries of tradition, grace, and expectation. From the moment she opened her eyes, her world was made of music, light, and ceremony. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a theater of power, where every glance, every gesture, every gown had meaning. Her cradle stood beneath chandeliers that never seemed to dim, surrounded by tapestries of angels and gods. Musicians played in her honor. Nobles bowed before her crib, as if before a sacred relic. The air smelled of roses, incense, and powder, the fragrance of privilege. Her mother, Queen Marie Antoinette, adored her fiercely. Having been ridiculed for years for failing to produce an heir, the queen now poured all her tenderness into her daughter. "She will be everything I was not allowed to be," she once told a lady of the court. The queen, often accused of frivolity, became almost maternal in a sacred sense when near her child, brushing her hair herself, walking with her in the gardens, even sneaking into her nursery to kiss her good night. To the queen, Marie-Thérèse was not just a princess, she was redemption. Her father, Louis XV, though distant by nature, found comfort in the little girl's quiet wisdom. She would often sit by his desk as he worked, her small fingers tracing the edges of his maps. He would smile. The tired, uncertain smile of a man unfit for his throne, but capable of great gentleness. "You will understand France better than I ever did," he once murmured. The child grew among marble statues, polished mirrors, and endless etiquette. She was taught to curtsy before she could walk, to smile at strangers though she feared them, to bow to portraits of ancestors she would never meet. The court adored her, and in their adoration, they trapped her. She was never just a child. She was a symbol. Every move, every word was scrutinized. Even her dolls were embroidered with the fleur-de-lis. But behind the glittering walls, a shadow was forming, invisible to those who refused to look beyond the mirrors of Versailles. The kingdom that adored her was rotting from within. Bread prices were rising. The poor starved while the court danced. Outside the golden gates, mothers wept for children who had no milk. While inside, a little princess drank from silver cups. She could not yet understand the murmurs that drifted in through the palace corridors, the talk of reform, liberty, justice. But sometimes, when she looked from the balcony at the gardens below, she saw faces pressed against the iron bars of the gates. Faces not of adoration, but of hunger. Marie-Thérèse loved to walk with her mother through the Petit Trianon, the small retreat Marie Antoinette had built to escape the suffocating rituals of court life. There, the queen, dressed in simple muslin gowns, played shepherdess and laughed freely. For a few hours, the queen and her daughter could pretend they were ordinary, two souls untouched by the weight of crowns. "Remember this," her mother would whisper. "Beauty is not in the palace, but in the silence of the morning." But silence, in France, was vanishing. Beyond the gardens, the world was stirring, and the storm that would one day sweep through Versailles was already gathering on the horizon. The queen's charm could no longer hold back the tide of resentment. The king's hesitation fed the anger of the people. Pamphlets began to circulate, mocking the queen as Madame Deficit, blaming her for every grain of hunger, every drop of gold spent. Yet within her nursery, Marie-Thérèse still played with ribbons and miniature carriages, unaware that her laughter echoed through walls soon to crumble. To her, Versailles was eternal. To history, it was already dying. On her 8th birthday, she received a gift that would later haunt her. A small ivory cross from her mother, engraved with the words, "Pour toi, ma fille bien-aimée," "For you, my beloved daughter." The queen told her to keep it close, for one day you will need it more than you think. Outside, the wind rattled through the palace chimneys. Inside, the candles still burned, stubbornly, beautifully, unaware of the darkness rising beyond the gates. In the glow of that fragile light, the child of Versailles smiled at her mother. Her curls brushed into perfection, her hands folded like a saint's. She did not yet know that everything she loved, the palace, the titles, the warmth of family, would soon be stripped away, one by one, until all that remained was the echo of a lullaby whispered through prison bars. She was the child of light, and history was already reaching to snuff out her flame. The world she knew began to unravel when she was barely 10. In the spring of 1789, the air in Paris grew heavy, not with perfume, but with smoke and fury. Crowds gathered in the streets, shouting words that echoed like thunder through the kingdom. Liberty, equality, bread. They were words Marie-Thérèse had never heard before, words that carried the hunger of a nation. Inside Versailles, the great mirrors still reflected chandeliers and silk gowns. But outside, the mirrors were cracking. France was starving. Taxes devoured the poor while the nobles feasted, and pamphlets flooded the city, accusing the queen, her mother, of ruin. They called Marie Antoinette Madame Deficit, a foreign witch who had bled the treasury dry. The queen's laughter, once admired, now sounded like cruelty to those who had nothing left to eat. Marie-Thérèse saw her mother stand taller through it all, proud, poised, untouchable, but she also saw her crying behind closed doors. "They will not forgive me for being happy," the queen once whispered. The little girl didn't understand. She only knew that every carriage ride drew more glares, every outing more insults. Versailles, once filled with applause, now felt surrounded by invisible walls of hatred. Then came July, the storming of the Bastille, a day that would end centuries of monarchy. The prison fell, heads rolled on pikes, and the crowds roared for more. Versailles trembled as the news arrived. The king tried to appear calm, but his hands shook when he signed decrees. The court murmured in fear, courtiers fled, and servants whispered of the end of the world. On the morning of October 5th, 1789, the storm reached the palace gates. Thousands of women, cold, hungry, furious, marched from Paris to Versailles, carrying pikes and muskets, crying for bread and vengeance. Their voices shook the marble halls. Rain poured, drenching their faces, but they kept shouting, "Bring us the baker's wife, and the baker's boy." They meant the king, the queen, and the little Dauphin. Marie-Thérèse's younger brother, Louis Charles. That night, as the mob camped outside, Marie-Thérèse was tucked into bed, unaware that history was climbing the stairs. Before dawn, screams erupted and gunfire. The crowd had broken into the palace, killing guards and storming toward the queen's bedroom. Marie Antoinette fled barefoot through hidden corridors, her heart hammering, her children's names on her lips. The sound of chaos reached Marie-Thérèse's chamber. Shouts, boots, the clatter of steel. Her governess locked the door and held her close as the world outside dissolved into terror. When the queen burst in moments later, pale as marble, she gathered both her children in her arms. "Do not be afraid," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "We are together. That is all that matters." By morning, the royal family stood on the balcony before the furious crowd. Rain still fell. The people screamed for the king's blood, then for the queen's. But when Marie Antoinette stepped forward, holding her son's hand, she bowed her head instead of pleading. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of weeping. Even in hatred, France recognized dignity. The next day, the gates of Versailles opened, not for a parade, but for an exodus. The royal family was ordered to leave their palace and move to Paris, under the protection of the people. Soldiers surrounded their carriage as they departed. Behind them, Versailles stood still, its fountains dry, its mirrors reflecting ghosts. The palace that had cradled kings for a century became a shell of memory. The journey to Paris was slow and cruel. Crowds followed the royal carriage for hours, waving pikes and shouting insults. Some sang songs mocking the queen, others carried pieces of torn royal banners. Marie-Thérèse clutched her brother's hand and tried not to cry. Through the bars of the carriage window, she saw faces twisted by hunger. Mothers with hollow eyes, children barefoot in the mud. They were no longer her people. They were her judges. When they reached the Tuileries Palace, their new home, it felt less like a residence and more like a gilded cage. Soldiers guarded every corridor. The windows were locked. Letters were opened before they could be read. Versailles had been a dream of light. Paris was the dawn of captivity. Her mother tried to smile, to pretend it was merely a change of scenery. "We are still a family," she told her children at dinner, though the dishes were chipped and the air smelled of damp stone. "As long as we are together, we are rich." But her eyes betrayed her. Each evening, Marie Antoinette sat by the window, staring at the distant city lights, her hand pressed against the glass. Louis XVI spent his nights studying maps, whispering with ministers about escape. Marie-Thérèse overheard fragments, words like Austria, border, safety. The idea of running terrified her. Versailles had been her whole universe, Paris, her cage, the world beyond, an abyss. In June 1791, the royal family finally tried to flee, disguised as commoners, traveling by night. The plan failed. They were captured in Varennes and dragged back to Paris under armed escort. Crowds threw stones, spat on the carriage, cursed the queen as a traitor. Marie-Thérèse, just 12, sat silent, holding her mother's hand as blood dripped from the queen's cheek where a rock had struck her. When they returned, the Tuileries no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a grave waiting to be sealed. Guards filled every hallway, the king was stripped of power, and whispers of republic filled the air. Marie-Thérèse would later write in her memoirs that this was the moment she first understood what fear was. Not the fear of pain or death, but the fear of seeing the world you were born into dissolve before your eyes. Versailles had fallen. France had changed its soul, and the child who had once lived among roses now learned that even innocence could bleed. The year was 1792, and the crown of France had finally fallen. Louis XV was no longer His Majesty. He was simply Citizen Capet. The royal family was dragged through Paris in an open carriage, their guards barely restraining the mob that spat, cursed, and waved severed heads on pikes. The cheers of Versailles had become the laughter of vengeance. When the heavy gates of the temple fortress shut behind them, the sound echoed like a verdict. The tower loomed over them, cold, gray, and cruel. It had once been a medieval stronghold. Now it would become their tomb. Marie-Thérèse, not yet 14, stepped from the carriage and clung to her mother's skirts. The air inside smelled of iron and mildew. Even the torches seemed afraid to burn. The guards took everything, their titles, their servants, their possessions. Even their names were replaced by numbers. Louis XVI was prisoner number 1. Marie Antoinette became prisoner number 2. Marie-Thérèse was simply number 4. The once royal family was reduced to shadows in a stone cage. Their cell was small and bare. Damp walls, straw mattresses, a single barred window through which no sun entered. Yet for a time, they tried to keep the illusion of normal life. Each morning, the king taught his children geography and religion. Marie-Thérèse would recite prayers, and little Louis Charles, her 8-year-old brother, tried to draw castles on scraps of paper. The queen mended clothes, whispering lullabies that no longer comforted anyone. But the walls had ears. Every gesture of tenderness was watched by guards who sneered and recorded their words. One night, when Marie-Thérèse reached to hug her brother, a soldier slammed his musket against the bars and shouted, "No more whispering!" In December, the king was separated from them. His trial had begun. Through the walls, Marie-Thérèse heard the distant chants of "Death to the tyrant." The queen tried to smile, to keep hope alive, but her hands trembled as she embroidered a small cross into a handkerchief. "He is strong," she whispered. "He will face it as a king should." Then came January 24, 1793, the day Paris turned red. At dawn, the guards came for her father. He kissed her forehead, kissed her brother's hair, and turned to the queen. For a moment, no one breathed. "I leave my soul to God," he said softly, "and my family to France." The door closed behind him. Hours later, the sound of drums rolled across the city. The air grew still, then shattered with a single cheer that rose from every street. The guillotine had fallen. Marie-Thérèse ran to the window, her heart pounding. Her mother stood motionless, eyes fixed on the gray sky. She did not weep. She simply knelt, took her children's hands, and whispered, "Your father is now in heaven. We must be worthy to join him." 3 months later, they came for her mother. It was October 16th, 1793. Before dawn, soldiers entered the cell. "Marie Antoinette, the widow Capet, you will follow us." The queen rose without hesitation. She kissed her daughter one last time. "Be brave, my child. Forgive them. They know not what they do." Marie-Thérèse held onto her sleeve until a guard tore them apart. The echo of her mother's footsteps down the corridor was the sound of history ending. Hours later, the cannon fired to announce the execution. The crowd roared again. Paris was satisfied. Now there were 3 left: the girl, her little brother, and her Aunt Elizabeth, the king's sister. Soon, even that small comfort would be taken. In the summer of 1794, the guards dragged her brother away, locking him alone in another cell for re-education. He was 9. At first, Marie-Thérèse heard his cries at night. He begged for his mother, for light, for water. Then the cries stopped. Weeks passed. Silence became her brother's only answer. The guards told her lies, that he was alive, that he was being raised as a good citizen. But one night, when she was cleaning the floor with a rag, she found a scrap of cloth beneath the straw, a child's drawing, faint and smudged. It was a family, a father, a mother, a girl, and a boy. Beneath it, the words, "Je vous aime," I love you. She pressed it to her heart and wept without sound. By now, her Aunt Elizabeth had also been taken, accused of crimes she had never committed. Marie-Thérèse kissed her hand through the bars before the soldiers led her away. "We will meet in a better kingdom," Elizabeth said. She was executed the next morning. The girl was alone, completely alone. She began talking to the walls, to her parents' ghosts, to God. In the margins of her prayer book, she wrote desperate words of faith. "Oh, my parents, my brother, protect me from heaven. I will die if you do not watch over me." The revolution outside raged on. Robespierre rose and fell, heads rolled daily. But within the tower, time froze. Seasons changed beyond her window, unseen. Dust gathered on her rosary. Her hair turned pale before its time. At night, she dreamed of Versailles, the fountains, the music, her mother's laughter. Then she would wake to the sound of rats scratching in the dark, and remember that the world she loved no longer existed. In December 1794, months after the terror began to devour its own children, her door opened. A new guard, younger, quieter, left a candle and bread without a word. For the first time in 2 years, someone looked at her not as a monster, but as a human being. He did not know her story, but history did. The girl who had once been the hope of France now lived as its forgotten prisoner, the ghost of a murdered dynasty, trapped in stone. In her journal, she wrote one final line before her release. "I have seen all that can be seen, the death of those I loved, the fall of my home, and the silence of my soul. There is nothing left but God." The Temple Tower had done its work. It did not kill her body. It killed her childhood. When the iron door finally opened in December 1795, the girl who stepped out was not the same child who had entered 3 years earlier. Her dress hung loose on her thin frame. Her hair had lost its shine, streaked with gray, though she was only 17. Her voice trembled when she spoke, as if each word had to pass through the dust of silence. The guards called her by her name again, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, as though it mattered, as though words could restore what time and grief had erased. Her release was not mercy. It was politics. After years of negotiations, the French Republic agreed to exchange the last surviving daughter of Louis XVI for several French prisoners held by Austria. It was a cold transaction, a royal soul traded like currency. When she was told she would be leaving France, she did not smile. "Where should I go?" she asked. "I have no home, no family, no France." On December 19th, her 17th birthday, she was escorted out of the temple under armed guard. The streets of Paris watched her pass, the same streets that had once screamed for her parents' heads. Now they stared in silence. She wore black, her head bowed beneath a veil. Some said she looked like a ghost walking among the living. Others whispered that she was a ghost, the last echo of the old world. At the border, she was received by Austrian officials who greeted her with ceremony and pity. They bowed, they wept, they called her Your Royal Highness, titles that now sounded absurd. When the carriage crossed into Austrian territory, Marie-Thérèse turned for one last look at the land that had destroyed her childhood. "Farewell, France," she murmured. "May you never suffer as I have suffered for you." In Vienna, she was welcomed by her mother's family, the Habsburgs, cousins, aunts, distant uncles who tried to comfort her with feasts and music. Yet everything felt alien. The language, the faces, the laughter. It all sounded too loud, too alive. She had forgotten how to exist among the living. She was placed under the protection of her cousin, the Emperor Francis II, and lodged in the Palace of Schönbrunn. The marble corridors reminded her faintly of Versailles, but to her they were only echoes, pale imitations of a world that no longer breathed. Each evening, she sat alone in a corner of the great hall, her hands folded over a small Bible. The courtiers whispered that she was gentle but distant, that her eyes seemed to look past the present into some invisible horizon. She refused to attend balls. She rarely smiled. When asked if she would like music, she answered softly, "I have heard too many drums." The nightmares never left her. She would wake in the middle of the night, screaming, convinced she still heard the guillotine outside her window, or her brother calling from the darkness. Sometimes, servants found her standing by the candlelight, her hands clasped tightly as if in prayer, whispering her parents' names. But she lived, and that, in itself, was both miracle and punishment. In her first letters written after freedom, she spoke not of vengeance, but of faith. "I owe my life to God alone," she wrote. "The world has taken everything else." She prayed for her father's soul every morning and for France every night. Not the France of banners and revolutions, but the quiet France of her memory, where her mother once braided her hair by a window filled with sunlight. Her hosts in Vienna adored her dignity. They called her the orphan of the temple. Portraits of her began to circulate, pale, sorrowful, saintly. She had become not a princess, but a symbol, the innocent sufferer, the daughter of martyr kings. Wherever she went, people bowed not out of loyalty, but pity. It was a strange kind of fame, the fame of survival. At times, she would walk in the gardens of Schönbrunn, the winter air sharp against her skin. She would watch the trees sway in silence, remembering another garden, the one at Versailles, where her mother once played shepherdess, laughing under the summer sun. The contrast was unbearable. Every leaf seemed to whisper names she could no longer say aloud. When priests asked what she desired most, she answered simply, "Peace, but I know I shall never have it." Yet there was strength in her stillness. She refused to speak ill of the revolutionaries who had murdered her family. "God will judge them," she said. "It is not for me to hate." But those who looked closely into her eyes saw that forgiveness and forgetting were not the same. Her Aunt Elizabeth's rosary never left her wrist. Her brother's drawing, the one she had found in the temple, she kept hidden in a prayer book. She carried those fragments like relics of a lost civilization. Letters from Europe began to arrive. Proposals from royal courts hoping to secure the last Bourbon princess as a bride. To many, she was a valuable connection, a symbol of legitimacy for any throne. To her, the thought of marriage felt like betrayal. "How can I marry?" she wrote to a confidant, "when my heart is buried in the temple?" But history had other plans. As the new century approached, whispers spread that she might return to France. Napoleon Bonaparte was rising, a soldier who called himself emperor. Monarchs abroad saw him as a usurper. The exiled Bourbons dreamed of restoration. In this shifting world, Marie-Thérèse became more than a woman. She became a claim, a symbol, a memory that refused to die. Still, she lived quietly, almost monastically, surrounded by candles, books, and prayers. Her hair, once golden, now framed her face like a pale halo. When the servants bowed, she would nod gently, saying, "Do not call me princess. Call me Thérèse." That name belonged to a happier child. And so she endured, not as royalty, but as testimony. The girl who had lost everything yet remained unbroken. The world might have changed, but she would not. She lived with the grace of someone who had already died once, and had learned how to keep breathing afterward. Because survival, for Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, was not freedom. It was penance. In 1799, 4 years after her release from the temple, the last surviving child of Louis XVI was persuaded, gently, diplomatically, relentlessly, to marry her cousin, Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême. He was the son of her uncle, the Count of Artois, who would one day reign as Charles X. The match had been arranged since her youth, back when she was still a laughing child in the gardens of Versailles. Back then, the thought of marriage meant a parade, music, and sunlight. Now, it was only duty. Marie-Thérèse agreed without protest. She no longer believed in happiness. "My life belongs to Providence," she wrote before the ceremony. "If marriage is a cross, I shall carry it." The wedding took place quietly in Mitau, the capital of Courland, far from France, far from the ruins of Versailles. There were no grand banquets, no music from gilded galleries, no crowds cheering outside. Only a handful of exiled nobles, thin and pale from years of wandering, stood beneath flickering candles as she vowed to be a wife. Her gown was simple white silk. Her veil, edged with black lace, was a concession to her eternal mourning. The Duke was a kind man, but not one who could pierce her silence. He had spent his youth in exile, training as a soldier, haunted by the same ghosts that shadowed her steps. He admired her strength, but he could not reach the part of her heart that still slept in the temple tower. Their union was one of shared grief, not passion. Two survivors bound by duty to a dynasty that no longer existed. At night, in the echoing corridors of their borrowed palaces, he would sometimes hear her whispering prayers, her voice trembling like candlelight. She prayed for her parents, for France, for her brother, and perhaps, though she never said it, for the ability to love again. But love never came. There were no children. Historians would later debate why. Some said her health was fragile after years of imprisonment. Others whispered that trauma had frozen her body as surely as her soul. Whatever the reason, her womb remained silent. To a royal family desperate for heirs, it was a quiet catastrophe. Yet Marie-Thérèse seemed almost relieved. "I have borne too many deaths to give birth to life," she once told her confessor. Her existence had become an act of remembrance. Each morning she dressed in black, her only ornament a small cross of jet. Even her laughter, rare as it was, sounded like an echo from another century. She refused the entertainments of court life. Balls, hunts, and music repelled her. When invited, she would answer gently, "The dead do not dance." Her husband respected her sadness, but did not share it. He lived in her orbit like a distant moon, dutiful, silent, always aware that she loved ghosts more than she could ever love him. They dined together in near silence, the only sound the clinking of silver and the rustle of her rosary beads. He once tried to comfort her by saying, We will make France proud again." She looked at him for a long moment and replied, "France has forgotten what pride means." In exile, she became known among royal circles as the widow of the living. Her presence inspired both reverence and unease. Younger nobles lowered their eyes in her company. Priests called her a saint of sorrow. She walked slowly, always veiled, her face pale and distant. When she spoke, her words carried the authority of survival. "Do not envy my birth," she once told a young girl who curtsied before her. "It is no blessing to be born where crowns are made of thorns." Her letters from this period reveal a mind steeped in memory. "I dream of Versailles," she wrote. "Not the Versailles of festivals, but the Versailles of my childhood, when I was too young to know that love could end." To her, every joy seemed suspicious, every comfort borrowed. She lived not for herself, but for the ghosts she refused to let go. Occasionally, she would visit her uncle, the Count of Provence, the self-proclaimed King Louis XVI, who ruled a shadow court in exile. He adored her, perhaps even envied her moral weight. She alone among the Bourbons had suffered without compromise. Her virtue gave the family a dignity that politics could not restore. In letters to allies, Louis XVI called her "our living testament," proof that God had not entirely forsaken their line. And yet, beneath her composure, there was an unhealed wound. She could never forgive the silence that surrounded her mother's death. When she prayed, she always ended the same way: "Forgive me for living." In the portraits painted during these years, her eyes dominate everything, large, mournful, piercing, as if they still saw the world through prison bars. Pain had refined her beauty into something sacred. Artists often portrayed her holding a small book or crucifix, standing against a storm-dark background. To some, she looked like a nun. To others, like a ghost queen. She rarely spoke of the revolution directly, but when she did, her words cut like frost. "They taught me," she said once, "that freedom built on blood is only another form of tyranny." In 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, news reached her in Mitau. She made no comment, only turned away and whispered, "Then France is not yet finished suffering." The years that followed passed in the rhythm of exile. Long winters, quiet masses, endless letters to friends who would never return. She tended to the sick, comforted widows, and taught village children to read. To the peasants who saw her kneeling among them, she was not a princess, but a mysterious woman in black who spoke softly of heaven. Yet in private, she was still a prisoner, chained not by iron, but by remembrance. Her husband once asked why she still wore mourning clothes after so many years. She answered, without looking up, "Because the guillotine never stops in my dreams." And so she lived, a woman married not to a man, but to her grief, faithful to the dead, faithful to a memory that no crown could resurrect. History would call her Madame la Dauphine, Duchess of Angoulême, the daughter of the king. But in truth, she was something else entirely, the widow of a vanished world. In 1814, after 2 decades of exile, the wind of history shifted once more. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had turned France into an empire of battlefields, fell from his throne. The armies that once carried his eagles across Europe were broken, and the Bourbons, thought extinct, were called back to reclaim the ashes of their kingdom. For Marie Thérèse Charlotte, it was the moment everyone else had prayed for, but the one she feared most. She was 40 years old when she returned to the soil of France, a land that had been both cradle and grave. Her carriage crossed the border in silence. There were no triumphant fanfares, only the sound of wheels over mud and the whisper of the wind through ruined fields. Peasants knelt as she passed, some weeping openly. They called her the orphan of the temple, the daughter of martyrs who had come home at last. But she did not wave nor smile. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun was setting, red, like a memory she could never unsee. Paris awaited her. The capital had changed beyond recognition. The palace of the Tuileries, where she had lived as a prisoner, had been restored as a royal residence. But to her, every corridor still reeked of fear. The echoes of footsteps in the marble halls carried the cries of another life. The sound of her mother's dress brushing past the walls, her brother's laughter, her father's soft voice reading from a prayer book. Time had moved on. Her soul had not. When she first set foot on Parisian soil, she insisted on traveling by carriage through the Place de la Concorde, the site once known as the Place de la Révolution, where her parents had been executed. Courtiers begged her to take another route, to spare herself the pain. She refused. "If I avoid it," she said, "then they will die a second time." As the carriage rolled across the square, she asked for the horses to halt. The crowd fell silent. She stepped out, dressed in deepest black, and knelt on the cobblestones where the guillotine had stood. For a moment, even the city seemed to hold its breath. The wind stirred her veil. The church bells in the distance tolled like mourning. Then quietly, she prayed. No one spoke. No one dared. When she rose, tears shone in her eyes, not for herself, but for a France that had forgotten how to remember. The following day, she entered the Tuileries Palace as Madame la Dauphine, wife of the heir to the throne. But titles meant nothing to her now. She moved through the gilded halls like a ghost revisiting its former life. Every window, every painting, every stair whispered of the past. Servants bowed and called her Your Royal Highness, yet she still felt like prisoner number 4. At court, people called her austere. She rarely laughed, rarely joined in conversation, and never danced. But those who saw her in private described a different presence. Gentle, compassionate, infinitely kind. She spent her mornings visiting hospitals, orphanages, and convents, distributing food and clothing to those who had nothing. She would kneel beside the sick, whispering prayers with them, sometimes pressing their hands to her lips as though seeking forgiveness. "She lives among the living," one Parisian wrote, "but her heart dwells among the dead." And yet, her return brought France a strange kind of moral rebirth. The people, seeing her humility, began to soften. Those who had once mocked her family now found themselves moved by her endurance. Pain had sanctified her. She became a living relic, not of royal grandeur, but of faith through suffering. Her uncle, Louis XVI, now king, adored her and relied on her counsel. She, in turn, treated him with quiet devotion, though she saw the world with clearer eyes than most politicians of the time. She had survived tyranny, revolution, and exile. She had nothing left to fear. Her advice was often blunt, her morality uncompromising. "Do not try to rule France by memory," she once warned a minister. "The people remember differently than we do." Still, the ghosts followed her everywhere. When she heard music, she thought of her mother's laughter. When the court applauded, she heard the shouts of the mob. When she saw children playing in the palace gardens, she thought of a boy dying alone in a prison cell. Each night, she lit a candle at her window, not for show, but as a ritual. "For the dead," she explained when asked. "They must never be left in darkness." The people adored her piety. Painters depicted her as a second Joan of Arc, a woman purified by suffering and returned to redeem her country. But she never claimed holiness. "I am only what grief has made me," she told a confidant. During official ceremonies, she stood beside her husband, calm and silent, while others cheered the restoration of the Bourbon line. Yet, even in triumph, her expression never changed. When asked why, she replied, "Because joy is not an inheritance." In the years that followed, she oversaw the restoration of several churches destroyed during the Revolution and established charities for orphan children. "So that no one will grow up as I did," she said. To the orphans, she was not a duchess, but Tante Thérèse. Aunt Thérèse, the gentle lady who always brought warm bread and listened without judgment. But beneath the kindness lay exhaustion. She often fainted from overwork, and her health began to fail. Doctors prescribed rest. She answered, "How can I rest when the dead still cry?" One evening, while returning from a service at Notre Dame, her carriage passed once again through the Place de la Concorde. She leaned out of the window, staring at the empty square bathed in moonlight. Her husband asked if she was all right. She whispered, "Yes. Tonight it is quiet. France is quiet." It was the closest she ever came to peace. Her return to France had not been a victory march. It was an act of mourning. She had come home not to reclaim a crown, but to bury the last ghosts of her childhood. And though she smiled when duty required it, those who looked closely at her face saw the truth written there. A sorrow so deep, it had become part of her grace. She was once the child of Versailles, born in light. Now she was the woman of Concord, kneeling in shadow, forgiving, but never forgetting. By the 1820s, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte had become the most venerated woman in France. Not because of her title, but because of what she had endured. To the court, she was a symbol of legitimacy. To the common people, she was the embodiment of suffering redeemed by faith. They called her La Sainte du Malheur, the saint of misfortune. Yet behind the veil of reverence, she remained a woman haunted by a kingdom's ghosts. Her days followed a rhythm of discipline that bordered on sacred ritual. At dawn, she attended Mass. At midday, she received petitioners, widows, soldiers' wives, starving peasants, and listened with patience, giving what little she could. She visited hospitals, kissed the hands of the dying, and wrote letters of comfort to prisoners. In the evenings, she prayed in her private chapel until the candles burned low. "I must do good," she wrote, "for evil has already done enough." The Tuileries, which once held her captive, was now her home again. Yet its corridors felt no less cold. At night, she would walk alone through its galleries, her footsteps echoing faintly, her rosary whispering through her fingers. She stopped sometimes at the window overlooking the Seine, where the city lights flickered on the water like trembling souls. To others, Paris had been reborn. To her, it was still morning. The Bourbon Restoration had brought stability, but not innocence. She could feel it in the air, the same bitterness that had once turned into revolution, waiting patiently beneath the surface. Politicians spoke of progress. She thought only of memory. "A nation that forgets its crimes," she said to her confessor, "is already preparing to repeat them." Her uncle, King Louis XVI, ruled with moderation, and under his reign France tried to heal. But when he died in 1824, her father-in-law, Charles X, ascended the throne. Overnight, her husband became the heir apparent, and she, the future queen. The courtiers rejoiced, a restoration within the restoration. Yet Marie-Thérèse felt only the weight of history closing its circle once more. She knew too well that crowns did not protect. They consumed. At court, she was respected, even feared. The younger women imitated her modesty, but could not imitate her stillness. She had the presence of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by anything mortal. Pain had refined her into marble. "She is the conscience of the Bourbons," said one diplomat. And like all consciences, she makes the living uncomfortable. Despite her piety, she was not naive. She saw the corruption, the intrigue, the hollow politics that poisoned her family's return. She warned her husband and father-in-law repeatedly that arrogance and blindness would once again turn France against them. "The people can forgive hunger," she told Charles X, "but they will never forgive pride." Few listened. The court had grown deaf in its own music. When the king reinstated harsh censorship laws and privileges for the clergy, unrest stirred again in Paris. Marie-Thérèse watched the signs with dread, the pamphlets, the protests, the murmuring crowds. It was the same song she had heard before, and she knew its ending. "We are dancing on the edge of an abyss," she told a confidant. "And I hear the drumbeats of '93 in my dreams again." Through it all, she continued her quiet mission of compassion. She founded schools and orphanages across France, each one dedicated to the memory of a member of her family lost to the revolution. She personally wrote the rules for their operation. "No child shall ever be punished for hunger, nor shamed for poverty." In her handwriting, one could still sense the trembling of the little girl who had once begged for bread in a prison tower. Her compassion made her beloved among the poor, but her unyielding morality made her unpopular among the rich. She refused luxury, gave away much of her allowance, and dismissed flatterers with polite indifference. She wore mourning black even to royal celebrations. When a lady of the court dared to ask if she would ever wear color again, she answered quietly, "France is still in mourning, and so am I." Music returned to the palace, but she never attended the balls. The sound of violins reminded her too vividly of Versailles, of innocence before ruin. "Every joy feels like betrayal," she confessed once to her confessor, as if smiling would mean forgetting them. And so she did not forget. Her husband adored her, but their life remained bound by solemn duty. He often called her "Mon ange triste," my sad angel. In her letters to him, she spoke not of love, but of purpose. "We are bound to serve the memory of those who died better than we have lived." He never complained. He knew that he shared his marriage bed with sorrow itself. The French people, too, could not forget her. When she appeared in public, silence followed her. No one dared cheer too loudly. Her presence carried the gravity of history. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see her pass. The daughter of the king they killed. For the generation born after the revolution, she was living history itself, a woman who had looked into the abyss and survived. In 1826, she made a pilgrimage to Saint-Denis, where her parents' remains had finally been reinterred. She stood before their tombs for hours, alone. Witnesses said she neither cried nor spoke. She simply touched the cold marble with her gloved hand and whispered something no one could hear. When she left, a guard found a small white rose placed between the two royal names, its petals already beginning to fade. France saw her as saintly, but her faith was not born of serenity. It was born of endurance. "Faith," she once wrote, "is not light in the darkness. It is the strength to keep walking when you can no longer see." The years passed, and revolutions brewed again. But Marie-Thérèse Charlotte stood unmoved, dignified, austere, and unbending in her sorrow. The revolution had taken her childhood, her family, her peace, and yet she refused to let it take her memory. She had forgiven France, but she would never let France forget. The summer of 1830 brought the echo she had dreaded her whole life, the sound of revolution returning like a ghost that refused to die. The July Revolution began not with swords, but with newspapers and barricades. In the streets of Paris, the cry rose once more. Down with the Bourbons, long live liberty. The same words that had once condemned her parents now filled the air again, 37 years later. History, it seemed, had learned nothing. King Charles X, her father-in-law, still believed the people loved him. But Marie-Thérèse could read the tremor in the air, the unease behind the cheers, the despair behind the silence. "The walls are cracking again," she told her husband, "and none of you hear it." Within weeks, Paris ignited. The tricolor flag returned, smoke rose over the boulevards, and the royal troops faltered. Memories sharpened like blades. The people no longer saw a monarchy restored. They saw the ghosts of tyranny reborn. Inside the palace, she moved with eerie calm. She knew this storm too well. She gathered a few belongings, a rosary, her brother's drawing from the temple, a small Bible worn thin from years of tears, and placed them carefully in a wooden chest. "I have carried less in my heart," she whispered. Her husband, now Dauphin, begged her to flee. Charles X signed his abdication in trembling hands, naming Louis Antoine the new king for exactly 20 minutes. Surrounded by shouting ministers and the cries of mobs outside, he too renounced the throne in favor of his nephew. France no longer wanted any of them. The Bourbon dynasty, resurrected twice, had died a third and final time. As soldiers approached the palace, Marie-Thérèse turned once more toward the window. She could hear the roar of the crowd, the breaking of glass, the same rhythm that had haunted her youth. "So, it begins again," she said, not with anger, but with weary acceptance. "France has chosen her curse." The family escaped under disguise, not as monarchs, but as fugitives. Their carriage left Paris by night, the torches of rebellion flickering behind them like a second sunrise. The roads were thick with smoke and rumor. At every checkpoint, her heart stopped, waiting for betrayal. But the guards let them pass, perhaps out of pity, perhaps because no one recognized the weary woman in black, who looked more like a nun than a queen. They crossed into Normandy, then sailed to England. The sea was rough. Rain lashed the deck as if the heavens themselves sought to erase their trail. Marie-Thérèse stood at the railing, the wind tearing her veil loose, watching the coastline of France fade into mist. She made the sign of the cross and murmured, "Forgive them again, Father, for they still know not what they do." In England, King George IV received them with courtesy and distance, hospitality without hope. They were given shelter at Holyrood Palace in Scotland, an old fortress of melancholy grandeur. It suited her perfectly. The damp stone walls reminded her of the temple, the silence of her exile in Austria. "I have always belonged to ruins," she said once to a companion. The British found her dignified, almost saint-like. She walked each morning through the gardens wrapped in a black shawl, her steps slow and measured, as if she were counting prayers. Children would curtsy as she passed, sensing they were in the presence of someone who carried history in her silence. She spoke little, and when she did, it was with a softness that made listeners lean forward, not to hear her better, but to understand how someone so wounded could still sound so calm. But she was not calm. At night, she wrote letters she never sent, to her mother, her father, her brother. In them, she described the new exile, the gray skies, the taste of salt and regret in the air. "It is all the same," she wrote. "Every country becomes a prison when you remember too much." England was kind, but not home. When her husband's health began to decline, they sought a gentler climate. Italy welcomed them, first Verona, then Venice, and finally Frosdorf in Austria, where the last Bourbons gathered like embers of a dead fire. She carried her few relics with her wherever she went: the cross from her mother, the rosary of her Aunt Elizabeth, the faded drawing of her brother. These were her kingdom now, 3 fragments of love that no revolution could confiscate. Frosdorf Castle became a sanctuary of quiet resignation. There were few visitors. The servants moved softly, as if afraid to disturb the past. In her chambers, she kept the shutters half closed, letting in only the kind of light that did not hurt the eyes. Every morning, she prayed for France, though she no longer expected redemption. "Nations," she told a priest, "are like souls. They must suffer to learn, and sometimes they die without learning." Her husband, broken by disappointment, often wept in her presence. She would take his hand and whisper, "We are the last leaves of a fallen tree. Let us fall with grace." When word reached them that France had crowned a new ruler, Louis Philippe, the citizen king, Marie-Thérèse merely nodded. "Then let them have a king who speaks their language," she said. "Perhaps that will save them from themselves." But deep down, she knew it would not. Years in exile passed like a slow prayer. She read scripture, wrote reflections, and kept a small diary in which she noted the anniversaries of each family member's death. Each date was marked with a cross. "The living forget," she wrote, "but I am not among the living." And yet, she never surrendered to bitterness. Visitors remarked that her face, though lined, possessed a serenity that came not from joy, but from forgiveness. When asked if she hated those who had killed her family, she answered, "Hate is a second death. I have no room left in me for death." In the gardens of Frosdorf, she planted white roses, one for each name carved in her heart: Louis, Marie Antoinette, Louis Charles, Elizabeth. When they bloomed in spring, she would stand among them in silence, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer. She had lost her crown, her country, her lineage, but not her memory. Exile, to her, was not punishment anymore. It was destiny fulfilled. The last chapter of a life spent learning how to live with sorrow and still remain gentle. And as the seasons turned quietly around her, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte became what history had always feared she would become. Not a relic of monarchy, but the living conscience of its fall. By the time she reached her 60s, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte had become a relic from another century, a living echo of an age drowned in blood and memory. The world around her had changed beyond recognition. Steam engines crossed the fields where kings had once ridden. Telegraphs whispered faster than prayer. But inside Frosdorf Castle, time stood still. The vast halls smelled faintly of wax and lilies. Portraits of the dead hung in every corridor, her father's calm, resigned face. Her mother's bright eyes captured forever before despair. The small, painted likeness of her brother, the lost Dauphin. She passed them every morning on her way to chapel, touching the gilded frames gently, as though greeting them still. Her husband, Louis Antoine, now Duke of Angoulême in exile, grew frail beside her. His spirit had been broken by the second fall of the Bourbons, and he spent his days reading the Psalms aloud by the fire. They lived more like monks than royalty, their lives measured not by days or politics, but by prayer and remembrance. Each dawn, she rose before the servants, lit a candle, and knelt alone in her private oratory. Her prayers were long, but not for herself. For France, she whispered. For those who died, and those who do not yet know what death means. She prayed for her parents' souls, as she always had, but also for the children of the revolutionaries who had killed them. The generations born from blood, now trying to build lives upon its ruins. Letters still arrived from across Europe, nobles asking her blessing, widows seeking advice, even Republican politicians curious about her opinions. She answered all with humility, writing in a precise, delicate hand. Her responses always ended the same way. May peace one day be worth the suffering that bought it. But peace was not something she ever truly found. It lived beside her like a ghost, visible only in moments of stillness. In the afternoons, she would sit by the window, her face turned toward the pale Austrian light. Her hair had turned white, soft as lace, her features sharpened by discipline. Sometimes, while writing, she would stop suddenly and stare into the air, her pen hovering above the page. Servants said she seemed to be listening to someone unseen. Perhaps she was. Though she had outlived everyone she loved, she never spoke of loneliness. It is a mercy, she said once to her chaplain, to remain when others are gone. That is how one learns to love without expecting return. Yet there were moments, quiet and fleeting, when her composure cracked. During winter vigils, the sound of the wind against the shutters made her flinch. It reminded her of the howling mobs of Paris. Each year, on January 21st, she fasted in silence, the day her father had been executed. On October 16th, she did the same for her mother. On June 8th, for her brother. Those days were marked not by tears, but by ritual. She lit 3 candles, said 3 rosaries, and spent the rest of the day without speaking. The servants called it La Semaine des Ombres, the week of shadows. Sometimes she would walk through the castle gardens at dusk, her veil fluttering in the cold wind. The white roses she had planted for her family were still there, blooming faintly against the stone walls. Visitors who saw her said she looked like a statue moving among graves. Yet her sadness was not bitter. Grief, she once told a visitor, is like the sea. You do not escape it. You learn to float. The exiled Bourbon gathered around her as though she were an anchor to their fading identity. Younger princes came seeking her advice. She spoke to them with quiet firmness. If ever you return to France, she said, go as servants, not as masters. The crown without humility is only a noose. They nodded, but she knew they would not listen. They never did. In 1844, her husband died after a long illness. She sat beside his bed until the end, holding his hand, murmuring prayers. When his breath stopped, she closed his eyes and whispered, "Now you may rest. You have carried your burden well." Those who were present said she did not cry. Instead, she walked straight to the chapel, knelt, and stayed there until dawn. The next morning, she appeared pale but composed, and said only, "I am the last." After his death, she withdrew even further into silence. The world outside spoke of revolutions, of new republics and empires. In 1848, when another uprising erupted in France, her third revolution, she simply crossed herself. The lesson was not learned, she said. The blood has not finished speaking. She never saw Paris again. Visitors to Frosdorf often left transformed. They described her as serene, luminous, otherworldly, as if her suffering had burned away every trace of vanity. Her blue eyes still held their steady calm, but behind them was an unfathomable distance. "It is like speaking with time itself," one diplomat wrote. Her voice carries the weight of centuries. In her last years, she took comfort in small things. The smell of wax polish in the chapel, the sound of a clock ticking in the hall, the sight of candlelight trembling on glass. Every evening, she asked the servants to open her window, no matter how cold, so she could feel the night air. "It smells like freedom," she would say softly. Perhaps the only kind left. Her letters from this period became gentler, almost tender. She no longer spoke of loss, but of gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for memory, for the chance to pray. "God gave me a long life," she wrote. "Perhaps so that I might prove the heart can endure what the world cannot." One evening, a storm swept through Frostdorf. Lightning flared across the sky, illuminating the castle like a cathedral. The servants found her in the chapel afterward, standing before the crucifix with her candle still burning. "It was beautiful," she said when they offered to lead her back to her room. "The thunder sounds like the world remembering." In the final decade of her life, her steps grew slower, her hands more fragile. But her spirit never dimmed. Even as she leaned on her cane, she walked with the dignity of a woman who had endured history itself. By then, almost everyone she had known was gone. But she remained, the last witness of a fallen dynasty, the last voice of a century's grief. And though the world had changed beyond recognition, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte still carried in her heart the echo of bells from Versailles, the drum beats from the temple, and the soft whisper of her mother's voice. It was her long twilight, not of despair, but of acceptance. She had lost everything but faith, and faith somehow had been enough. On October 19th, 1851, as the autumn wind sighed through the trees of Frostdorf, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, the last child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, quietly slipped away. She was 72. No priests crowded her bedside, no courtiers waited for her final words. Only a candle, her rosary, and a faded sketch of her brother lay beside her. Her last breath came like a prayer. "I am going to them now," she whispered. "Versailles, Tuileries, Temple. All will be quiet again." She was buried far from the country that had both crowned and crucified her family. No trumpets marked her passing. Only a few mourners stood in the pale light, and among them someone murmured, "She was France's memory, and France forgot." Yet history did not forget. She outlived a dynasty, a revolution, and an empire. She endured what no throne could bear, the loss of everything but faith. And in that quiet endurance, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte became what no crown could ever make her: immortal.